they turned for help to what they believed was a science of money. One after another, Labour and Conservative governments became convinced that if they followed what they thought were a set of scientific laws, the economy would grow faster. The perceived tide of decline could be reversed. But instead of restoring the country's fortunes, the economic experiments have failed to halt Britain's relative decline. The government now faces the worst recession since the war. This is the odd story of how politicians came to believe there was a technical way to make Britain great again.
10 years ago, 1 car in every 3 bought in Sweden was British. Today, we've less than 10%.
Now that's a sad story, but let's take a quick sample here on this bridge in central Stockholm and see just what the Swedes are driving. Well, there's a Swedish Volvo, a Swedish Saab, that is another Swedish Volvo over there, a Swedish Volvo.
One after another, other European countries who we were used to thinking of nice guys but poorer, began to get within shouting distance of us and passing. It's like being in a sailing race and seeing people you didn't think were good enough or hadn't scraped the bottoms of their boat well enough, nevertheless overhauling you.
A German Ford truck, an English Zephyr, congratulations Ford, a Mercedes-Benz.
People began insistently to ask if they can once get on a growth path of that steepness, won't they soon overtake us properly?
And a Volkswagen. Well, in that lot, 1 British car, 1 Ford.
But the blame of the mismanagement of the British economy doesn't rest wholly or even principally on the succession of chancellors. All have been paralysed by the reactionary men of the Treasury, men well versed in the ways of ancient Greece or the customs of the latter-day Roman Empire. With a healthy contempt for mere economists, they have proclaimed their dogma of a sound a pound.
What was holding Britain back, it was decided, was the old-fashioned idea that the civil servant's job was simply to keep the economy stable. In 1961, the Conservative government set up NEDI, the National Economic Development Council, in what had been a gentleman's club in Westminster. It was advised by young economists convinced they could make the economy grow much faster.
Oh, yes, this is my old room. A splendid room, isn't it? Yes. I'm sorry it's all boarded up, the windows there, because, you know, there's a balcony out there. As you know, the growth target of NEDI was 4% a year between 1961 and 1966. And I had visions of myself getting out onto that balcony and at the end of 1966 proclaiming to the cheering crowds below, 4%, we've done it.
Many of this generation of economists had been taught with the aid of a large machine worked by water. Built by Bill Phillips, an engineer turned economist, it has lain disused for years.
That powers these 2 parts over here, which is where money can actually come into the economy. The actual water flowing around is the money going through the economy.
That enabled you to illustrate, for instance, what would happen if you try to grow the economy, pump more money into the economy. For instance, you could increase government expenditure and see what the effect of that is through the workings of the economy, the interaction of all the variables on growth. Of course, if the economy is very prone to imports, people might simply spend their money to import foreign goods. Or if the economy is operating at a high level of activity, then that would lead to inflation.
NEDI's economists did not have a new theory, but they believed they could use existing techniques in a new way. They saw themselves as followers of the economist Maynard Keynes. He had shown how to manage an economy by increasing or decreasing demand. The problem was that every time you increased demand too much, imports flooded in and wages rose. But Neddy's economists were convinced they could control a boom. They would plan investment in industry and the government would hold inflation down. The bad old days of stop-go would be over.
Now we were going into something quite new. We were going to try and increase the rate of growth, and we thought all sorts of ideas about how it might be done.
It was an exciting prospect of trying to do something and trying to change something. The possibility of fiddling with the screws and the settings and the instruments and getting more out of the economy, making it work better. And it was fascinating. It was as if you offered a chemist for the first time in his life a laboratory in which he could actually pour one chemical into another and watch them fizz, whereas previously he'd just reasoned that they might fizz.
1%, 1%, and what are we to fear? A lousy little 1% and paradise is here. An extra little effort and the country's gonna boom.
Our plans for the future of Britain in the coming year are clear and comprehensive. We have accepted with enthusiasm the Neddy target of a 4% growth rate, and all our actions have been designed to achieve it. This nation must not jog along. This nation must be inspired with the determination to achieve great things.
Factory owner called his men and said, I'm confident you'll rally to the challenge and produce that 1%. And up then spoke a worker, do our wages rise or what? And the boss said, most amusing, and sacked him on the spot.
Look, in that speech of yours, give them plenty of the old working your fingers to the bone stuff. Oh, and don't forget all that bunk about export or die.
By 1963, the economists' promises seemed to be coming true. The Conservatives had poured money into the economy, and sure enough, it had begun to grow.
They had placed their bets on growth. They talked about it a lot. There was an announcement about it, white papers, speeches, and all the rest. In our system of politics, when something important like that is put on the table by the government of the day, the opposition has to respond to it.
My purpose tonight is to have a word with you about the future of Britain. The outstanding thing we ought to do, obviously, is to get up our economic strength, operating a national plan, a plan for steady, continuous, controlled production and expansion.
It was natural for the Labour Party to say, OK, you're going to have growth, but we can do better than that. And if you're aiming for 2.5%, we'll aim for 3%. If you're aiming for 3%, we'll aim for 4%, so that the bets were raised.
This election is about the standing of Britain in the world. Whether we're going to go on trailing behind other countries, or whether, as we believe, Britain can recapture the lead we once held amongst the nations of the world. We're tired of being pushed around. But if we're going to assert ourselves, this means we must have economic strength at home. For if we stand still at home, we stand still abroad.
Labour promised a national plan, run by a separate Department of Economic Affairs under George Brown. It would make Britain grow by a quarter in just 6 years. It was a seductive dream for a socialist party, for if the economists could produce this growth, then Labour's leaders would avoid what they had always thought inevitable, the battle to redistribute the country's wealth. Instead, there would be more for everyone. But it all depended on the economists' promises that they had the technical solutions to the politicians' problems.
We saw ourselves as providing the politicians with a potential menu of outcomes, but if the politicians would give us some indication, then we could set the instruments in such a way as we could deliver reasonably enough, give or take the various shocks that would occur in the economy, the kind of outcomes that the politicians wanted.
There's one basic fact. Labour has a clear majority. We have a Labour government.
But Labour had come to power just as the boom the Conservatives had begun was overheating. Imports were flooding in and wages rising. This was the point when in the past a halt would have been called. But Labour were determined to press on.
Mr. Brown, we've been discussing the economic situation this morning.
We've been discussing the affairs...
Labour had missed out a vital component from the plan, the economists told them. They should devalue the pound and so make Britain's exports cheaper.
We've been working very hard, yes.
But in the politicians' eyes, devaluation would undermine precisely what they were trying to achieve, to make Britain great again.
Wilson was a great one who believed in sterling. Sterling was the centre of everything. And he always said that he would defend the pound and we'd have a place east of Suez. And it was a sort of nationalism of a kind.
After that, all talk of devaluation by economists and everyone else was forbidden. I personally used to do little sums on scraps of paper in my room in the DEA. When anyone opened the door, I would hastily put them into my drawer.
There are millions of workers in this country who will never get fair play until you've got a decent incomes policy. Can't you get that into your head?
By 1965, the boom was clearly out of control. Faced with inflation, the government tried to hold down wages and prices, but to no avail. It also faced repeated runs on the pound, as foreign investors lost confidence in Labour's management of the economy.
You've got your figures wrong again. The cost of living since last
Friends, we'd like you to meet our first contestant tonight who wants to play W Money. Here we go.
The national plan now became a game between the politicians whose fortunes depended on it and their economists, who had begun to realise the economy was now far beyond their control. They were being used.
I think the moment I really realised it was a gimmick was when, after we'd finished work on it, and it was the summer, I think it was the summer of 1965, I hadn't very much to do, and so I decided I'd look at the details of the plan and see all the different measures, the things like the decision that you double expenditure on road building, for instance, and try and work out what effects these might have on the growth rate of the country. And I laboriously worked through, making my best guesses and calculations, not having been particularly told to do this by anybody, and came up with the results, and they were well short of anything that might have produced the 25% growth. And I wandered along to my seniors and said, hey, look, I've done this useful little exercise. And they weren't in the least interested. Nothing to do with it at all.
The fight for the pound is on. After last week's depressing trade figures and the rise in the bank rate, after a weekend of growing speculation and 3 days of shoring up the pound and exchange market, Mr. Harold Wilson himself cried stop.
What went wrong was that foreigners who held the pound decided in unison that Britain was no longer to be trusted. There was a wave, there was a mood.
Well, Americans, have you got any money here, Harvey? We could pay up to 3 7/8, it's damn sure.
And what the government has done is to respond to the mood by producing something which demonstrates a will to deflate this economy, which is bound to crush it, in my view. In other words, we're condemned to no growth.
On July the 20th, 1966, in effect, the national plan was kiboshed.
It's all over, I think.
That evening, I went home and I watched the World Cup. It was the year that England won, you may remember. I was disappointed that the sort of things we hoped might have happened over the years had ended in this way. It showed that when we had a crisis, we were going to damp down demand and have a stop in the good old-fashioned way. We really had to go for an overkill in order to stop the country essentially almost going bankrupt. Then I went to bed.
England, the world champions.
This is my lovely day. This is the day I shall remember, the day I'm dying.
The attempt to plan growth had failed. Britain was left with little expansion and political disaster.
Will be always
Most economists blamed it on the government's failure to devalue. Few asked whether the weakness of Britain's currency was really a symptom of something much deeper, far beyond the power of their techniques to deal with. A year later, the government bowed to the inevitable and devalued. But it was far too late. The economy had long ago come juddering to a stop.
What do you think of this devaluation?
It's very sad end to a period of mismanagement of our country's affairs.
I mean, after all, the government did go in with £800 million deficiency, and I bet they were very hard to try and pull us out of it.
So who do you blame for this?
I've been the financiers, the capitalist system.
I blame the government, of course. You hold them personally responsible? Certainly. Who else makes decisions? Do you feel that, in fact, a battle, a very important one, has been lost?
Not a battle. I think this was a skirmish, perhaps, rather. Well, the serious answer is yes, an important battle has been lost.
As a result of that experience, we had to abandon the notion, tacitly and slowly, but abandon it all the same, that the planning apparatus itself was the unique and certain method of achieving the aim of faster growth. We still believed in faster growth, and we still, many of us, that it was achievable, but this particular path to its achievement was no longer key, was no longer essential, could no longer be relied upon.
Good evening and welcome to the Money Programme. Tonight on the Money Programme we're going to look at money. Lots of it, on film and in the studio. Some of it in nice piles, others in lovely clanky bits of loose change. Some of it neatly counted into fat little hundreds, delicate fives stuffed into bulging wallets, nice crisp clean checks.
Money, I love the stuff. It's marvellous stuff.
I don't think anyone can ever have, I suppose, too much money. I think I'm reasonably comfortable.
I like it. I need it.
In the early 70s, many economists began to find they no longer understood how money behaved. The new Conservative government under Edward Heath had tried what was called a dash for growth. They poured in money by liberalising credit and increasing public spending. For a moment, the economy boomed. But then the strangest thing happened. Prices and unemployment began to rise together. People called it stagflation.
All a girl needs.
30p for a deck chair this week. Blimey, it was only 15p last week. This inflation's killing me.
Now, I happened to arrive in the Treasury in 1970. When I got there, people really felt that they didn't quite understand how the economy worked anymore. And one particular example of this was that we saw unemployment and inflation rising at the same time. And that was something that should have been quite impossible. While this was going on, they're sitting in Chicago, in the States, with the monetarists who said, no, we know perfectly well what's going on. We can explain it. You've been led astray by your Keynesian beliefs, and we can explain precisely what's going on, and it's all to do with the growth of the money supply.
I and people who believe the way that we did were saying that a continuation of the policies was going to lead to higher inflation and more unemployment. It represented a recognition that fine efforts to produce paradise on earth were producing something very different than what was intended.
Friedman argued that any attempt to put money into the economy to make it grow was doomed to failure. But he was not challenging the idea of the economy as a predictable system, only how it worked. He considered his laws were as powerful and objective as those of the physical sciences.
It was scientific. Inflation is not a communist phenomenon. It's not a capitalist phenomenon. It's a printing press phenomenon. That's a scientific statement. And you will only have inflation in output. You can only stop inflation by slowing down the rate of monetary growth.
Monetarism offered an attractive technical explanation for the problem of inflation. But from it would come in less than 10 years another scheme for Britain's salvation. A set of scientific rules which, if the politicians followed them correctly, would create the right conditions for economic growth. It began with a disillusioned group of economists. They included two influential journalists, Peter Jay of The Times and Sam Britton of The Financial Times.
We were found to be stimulating and interesting, which are the English words for damning people, and we were always regarded as good for a puzzling interlude in a program such as this.
Of a complete runaway inflation and an internal collapse of confidence in the currency.
I'm sorry, I think, Mr. Britton, that's an exaggeration when you start talking about the runaway inflation in Germany after the First World War. I think, quite frankly, that that's an exaggeration that can't be sustained by anyone.
But I think...
Can we stay on our home ground for the moment?
Yes.
If there was one place where we tended to bump into each other, it was the Institute of Economic Affairs.
Good God Almighty. This is the right place, the cooperative whatnot thing?
Yes, do come in. We were just about to begin without you.
Oh, I took the wrong turning, and not for the first time. Found myself in a room full of trade unionists cooking up the next wage claim. All Tories, of course. Didn't take to me at all.
Milton Friedman would set up a table here to maximize the array of people that we could fit in. We could probably fit in 20 or 25 people in this small room. And he would develop his argument briefly, very emphatically, in strong form. And he would say, if you want details of this and particular episodes in American history, I can go back to that. And then the discussion would take place.
An American thriller with the germ of a good, almost brilliant idea about a group of single-minded men who plan and execute a particularly daring bank robbery, right?
I enjoyed very much those lunches. They were bright people who came, and you know, it's no fun talking to people who all agree with you. The only thing that's really interesting is talking with people who differ from you. You will change your ideas, and you hope they will change theirs.
To start with, I must admit, I didn't believe the monetarists for a moment. This seemed totally implausible. This was the sort of economics that I'd been told to discard for all the time I'd been learning economics. It was a joke, really. It wasn't to be taken seriously. Whatever else one used to explain inflation, it wasn't the money supply.
Bit far-fetched, perhaps. You couldn't see it happening in real life?
Oh, I wouldn't go as far as that. Life's always surprising me.
In February of 1974, Edward Heath's government fell, amid power cuts, a 3-day week, and never-ending inflation. They were direct consequences of his crude dash for growth. The time was ripe for the monetarists, in particular Alan Walters, a professor from the London School of Economics. He began to attract both press and politicians with apocalyptic warnings of what was to come.
A reduction in output, an increase in unemployment, and at the same time, rampant inflation. Inflation of the order of perhaps 30%, perhaps even increasing as we go on. There is a real danger of hyperinflation.
Alan Walters had snubbed me when I went back to meet old friends. Once the government fell and I was back as a member of Parliament without a government post. And Alan Walters refused to shake my hand. He said, "You've been debauching the currency. Why should I welcome you back?" And I started to rethink what we'd been up to, and a fellow called Alfred Sherman was very influential in convincing me. He used to say, "Don't you know, Keynes is dead, Keynes is dead." I didn't understand what he meant.
He turned to me for help, and I managed to persuade him to go further and look at the whole Keynesian mumbo-jumbo, the panacea.
I mean, Keith Joseph was a mesmeric? Keith Joseph was a marvellous, spellbinding speaker. And you would see him on television. In the 70s, he used to go to universities and get pelted with eggs and have to be taken around the back way by the police.
Keith Joseph toured the country, translating monetarism into a political programme. The primary job of economics was no longer to create employment, he said. It was to reduce inflation.
After having failed to persuade the shadow cabinet to reconsider our economic policies, I warned them that I'd have to make a speech. Well, the speech was made. I remember that I said to Sam Britton, who looked at one of the drafts, "This speech has been through 9 drafts. We're trying to get it right." And Alfred Sherman from the background said, "Yes, and I wrote 13 of them." Well, we slogged at that speech.
Now, what he did, and this was very courageous of him, was that he went beyond presenting monetarism, a technical gimmick, and he, if you like, came out in the way that homosexuals had done. He came out on the fact that this involved abandoning full employment as an aim of monetary policy.
Inflation is threatening to destroy our society. The distress and unemployment that will follow unless the trend is stopped will be catastrophic. Inflation is caused by spending more than we produce, too much money, chasing too few goods, deficit financing, printing money. Mild inflation seemed a painless way of maintaining full employment, encouraging growth, and expanding the social services. We now see that inflation has turned out to be a mortal threat to all three.
But Labour was in power. As before, they had inherited the chaos of a Conservative boom. Yet this time, none of the traditional Keynesian methods offered them any help, because inflation and unemployment were rising together. It was something the Keynesians believed impossible. By the end of 1975, the economists advising the government were lost.
My memory is, I think it was a dinner party, deliberately organised, where the main economic modelers were there. The Treasury was represented, the Bank was represented, the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, London Business School. I was a fly on the wall, and they were talking about the medium-term projections and their models. And they were unanimous that they could not project what was going to happen to inflation or to unemployment or the balance of payments. There was almost total agreement around the room that the UK was in serious danger of going into absolute decline, that was negative growth, not just growing at a slower rate than other industrialised countries. That is when the civil servants in the Treasury and the Bank of England realised that the UK economy had arrived at the brink of the abyss. They had sight of the awfulness of what that abyss might look like, and they were shell-shocked as a result of it.
Believe me, Lord, we've tried so hard. We've tried everything. Everything.
Then, in March 1976, Britain fell into the abyss.
2030, 2020. Change it! Change! 2025.
Foreign investors, led by American bankers, panicked. The pound began to slide against the dollar, and nothing would stop it.
Sorry?
Just lost 2025 and stop it.
10.25, stock it.
It dropped 100 points. We don't know why. It just dropped 100 points when everything else was staying sturdy.
Britain faced bankruptcy. In desperation, Labour turned to the International Monetary Fund for a loan. An IMF team came to London. They were determined that the only way to restore confidence was for the British government to adopt monetarist policies.
The only reason you are asking for an IMF loan is in order to have the IMF experts tell you to do what you know very well you should do on your own. It's in order to get the political backing of the IMF to make politically palatable policies, which your politicians know very well are desirable, such as cutting government spending, such as lowering the rate of growth of the quantity of money, measures of this kind, which are inevitable in any event.
In a speech that could have been written by Keith Joseph, Prime Minister James Callaghan told the Labour Party why it had to do what the financial markets wanted.
We used to think that you could spend your way out of a recession and increase employment by cutting taxes and boosting government spending. I tell you in all candour that that option no longer exists, and that insofar as it ever did exist, it only worked on each occasion since the war by injecting a bigger dose of inflation into the economy on every occasion followed by a higher level of unemployment as the next step.
It was presented scientifically, but then they're always presented scientifically as being the only way of doing it. There is no alternative. And this gripped people, but at the same time you must never forget that politics is in the pursuit of an interest and an ideology, and if the scientist helps you with the ideology, you use him. If he doesn't, you disregard him. So the conflict between, as it were, Milton Friedman and Keynes was a political conflict. It wasn't really that it was people solemnly assessing the different values of two sets of ideas. One benefited one group, another benefited another.
In December 1976, the IMF granted a loan to Britain. That same month, Milton Friedman was awarded the Nobel Prize. In just 5 years, his economic theory had moved from the margins to centre stage. It was seen by many politicians as the only solution to Britain's disastrous economic position. And waiting in the wings was Friedman's most devoted follower, a politician who believed it was possible to use monetarism as the basis of a plan to regenerate the country. Keith Joseph was now the closest advisor to the new leader of the Tory party, Margaret Thatcher. He and the economists around him had drawn up what was called the medium-term financial strategy.
The boss.
Coffee, and then they want us all out. Angus, hello, in you go. Any particular? I'll bring you all out in a moment.
The plan was to combine monetarism with another theory from economics called rational expectations. It said that whenever a government changes policy, it will only work if the politicians can persuade people they are going to stick with it, whatever happens.
We believe that in announcing and publishing a mid-term financial strategy of what we were going to do with the crucial element of the money supply, we would persuade the negotiators, the managements and the trade unions, and the opinion formers that there must be some limit to pay claims if jobs were not to be priced out of the market. Rational expectation.
It was pure Friedmanism. You would have, in order not to frustrate expectations, you would have to announce firmly your intentions for some years ahead. You would then have to stick to those intentions. And people would get adjusted to this, and they'd begin to act in anticipation, and you would begin to get a benign return to the stable system.
It was to get away from short-termism. And in that respect, it had something in common with the national plan, a comparison of which I'm not ashamed.
And as with the national plan, it was all very simple. The supply of money was to be reduced by raising interest rates and cutting public spending. Inflation would fall and enterprise flourish. Instead of putting money in, as Labour had done 15 years before, this time the theory said it should be tightly controlled.
We are gathered here to discuss phase one of the operation. Now, I don't have to tell you that as a general rule, banks take very good care of people's money. They are not going to give it to us, so we shall have to take it.
Monetarism worked throughout the 19th century, when we were the envy of the world, with our people growing in numbers and generally prospering, generally, despite all the horrors of the time, generally prospering, with the world looking to us for how to do it. It could work again. There arose a slightly messianic sense of mission.
He's a nutcase, you know, no getting away from it. He'll end up with a knighthood.
Haven't you heard of inflation?
Tell you what I don't want to see.
What's that?
Labour in power again.
Labour in power? Was that the Marx Brothers?
No, another bunch of comedians.
Coming shortly, the Conservatives.
I can't bear Britain in decline. I just can't. We who either defeated or rescued half Europe, who kept half Europe free, when otherwise it would be in chains. And look at us now.
The Thatcher government is a kind of an experiment in whether it will be possible in a democratic society that has gone as far as Britain has gone to change course in an orderly, effective way to set Britain on a new road. If the Thatcher government succeeds, it will be an example that will not be lost on the United States or the rest of the world.
The latest unemployed from the Royal Stafford helped form an unwelcoming committee for Mrs. Thatcher as she arrived at the
But the
Royal
economy did not behave in the way the monetarists predicted. The squeeze on money led to a wave of factory closures, while inflation continued to rise.
Wasn't it? Which factories closed?
A small one, which has suffered lack of investment, among other things.
I've been in insolvency for all my professional life, and I think up until 1980, I used to go in with a great deal of confidence that with new management and perhaps some sort of reorganisation, something could be done. It was very sad to have to go onto the shop floor in the early 80s into a company knowing, in fact, that there wasn't much chance of selling that business and that, in fact, the business would come to an end.
This is what would normally be a working day. It's the middle of the week. And we're now down in this plant, which produces well over half the cast iron baths for the United Kingdom, on to 1 week on, 1 week off. And that's an immediate and practical effect of the strict monetarism policy that the government is carrying out.
The managing director said, I'm very sorry to tell you, but as from this minute, the firm has gone into voluntary liquidation. That was it.
And somebody shouted, will we get any wages? And he said, you'll get nothing.
There now follows a government statement on the current employment figures.
Oh, dear. Oh, dear, oh, dear, oh, dear.
The government seems to have totally lost its way in terms of the interaction of 4 economic indicators on British industry.
Oh, God.
As every member of any firm knows, once with high interest rates as a weapon for controlling money supply, what is the first thing that has to be cut? Investment. Because you still have to pay wages and you still have your current costs.
One day we may be able to afford it. I get the economic policies right.
The government would say, just hang on and stop making such a fuss now.
Yeah, all I can say is that the government isn't standing where I'm bloody well standing.
Even more mystifying was the behaviour of the money supply. Despite the squeeze, it was still growing, something the monetarists thought impossible.
Well, it was all a bit embarrassing. People like me were at the Bank of England because we'd been forced, the government had signed up for this path of gently declining monetary aggregates. And instead of the monetary aggregates gently declining, some 5 or 6 months after this new policy was put into operation, they took an enormous jump. And it was very difficult to know why, or to know what ought to be done about it.
And perhaps the low point was when I called round to see someone who I regarded as a friend and a neighbour, and they actually drew the curtains when I went into the room so that no one could see that they'd actually invited me into their house.
Why?
Well, they didn't wish to be associated with this rampant Thatcherite who was responsible for the rising unemployment.
Did you think you were responsible?
I could see that the actual conduct of policy was causing immense strife.
By the end of 1980, unemployment had nearly doubled. Manufacturing output had fallen by a sixth. Britain was declining faster than even in the darkest days of the 1930s. Despite this, the politicians were convinced they were right. The laws of their science told them so.
Let me just have a word about monetarism and monetary control first. I mean, you all know full well that if you produce too much of something, its value will fall. That's elementary. It isn't a newfangled theory. It is as essential as the law of gravity, and you can't avoid it.
People used to say, you're destroying my job, and I was absolutely secure in my conscience that their negotiators and their employers were destroying their jobs by not following rational expectations and seeing that if they didn't accommodate unit labor costs by a combination of pay increases allowed and rising productivity to what would keep their prices internationally competitive, jobs would go. So there was I, absolutely clear in my conscience, and there were they convinced in their, what I would call invincible ignorance, that I was an enemy. Yes, it was awkward time.
There's no question that what was happening did, in my view, a great deal of damage to the economy. The politicians of the day will never admit to that. They never admit to making mistakes at all. But it's quite clear that's what was happening. They were trying to do it right, but they got it wrong.
But by the end of 1980, the government's in the following dilemma, that if, having started on this policy, which is a medium-term policy, it abandons them simply because something's going wrong, it loses its entire credibility. Now, that, of course, is the case if these policies are right, but they simply haven't started to work yet. The dangerous worry was that the policies were actually wrong.
In January 1981, Alan Walters became Mrs. Thatcher's economic advisor. Although a convinced monetarist, he agreed with Sir John Hoskins that interest rates would have to come down. This in turn would reduce the exchange rate and make exports more competitive. But the problem was how to do it without admitting that all the destruction of the past 2 years had been for nothing. The only solution, they said, was to cut even more from public spending. That way the government would be seen to be keeping up its squeeze on the money supply.
What we said was, we will take a deep breath and take an enormous amount of money out of the economy, but at the nadir of a major recession. I mean, it's against every textbook that's ever been written, or all the Keynesian conventional wisdom which prevailed at the time. And thus, hopefully, by that insurance, make it very unlikely that we would have to put interest rates back up again just at the wrong moment. At a meeting with Mrs. Thatcher and Geoffrey Howe, they were both absolutely taken aback. I think they could hardly believe their ears. And then Mrs. Thatcher saying very indignantly, you know, it's all very well for you, but you don't have to stand up and defend it in the House.
Do what you're told and no one will get hurt. Over there, everyone.
In the budget of 1981, public borrowing was cut by a fifth. 364 leading economists wrote to the Times and the Prime Minister, accusing her of virtually destroying the economy.
Just to impress upon you the need of caution.
We seem to live in a time when we are beginning to learn how much we don't know, because of all the disciplines, economics, I should have thought, would have had at least some great heads in agreement, and yet there's no greater disagreement in the field of economics than among great economists. You have this extraordinary feeling of nobody being in complete control.
That summer, there were riots in English cities that even some cabinet members blamed on the economic policy. Unemployment headed towards 2.5 million. Inflation did begin to fall, but the money supply continued its mysterious rise. It became clear that the fundamental law of monetarism, the relationship between the money supply and inflation, didn't work. Ever so quietly, this solution to Britain's problems was discarded. Finally, the man who had first brought the monetarist message to Britain was publicly told it was over.
Monetarist economists believe in something called the natural rate of unemployment, which is supposed to be the rate at which inflation stops or ceases to accelerate. Now, do you think that we, Prime Minister, with all-time record unemployment figures this week, have yet reached that natural rate, even though inflation is still proceeding sufficiently to halve the value of money every 15 years?
It's not a doctrine to which I've ever subscribed. It's one which I think actually came in with Milton Friedman. I used to read about it, I used to look about it. It's not a doctrine, it's a theory to which I've never subscribed.
Some of those who had lived through the experiment now became deeply pessimistic. One economist saw it as proof that it was fundamentally impossible to change, in a predictable way, how an economy behaved. As in other sciences, his observation had a formal name, Goodhart's Law.
Goodhart's Law said that if ever the government decides to rely on any particular statistical relationship as a basis for policy, as soon as it did that, that relationship would fall apart. And that's just what happened. The implication is that what you should try and do is not to disturb things too much and let individual agents go on and try and make the best of the situation as each of them sees it individually.
garden. Whatever promised you a rose garden.
It was a conclusion that fitted well with conservative philosophy. If there was nothing that governments could do, then the economic agents in a newly liberated city of London should be left alone. Unlike the economists, they seemed to know how money worked.
The city's growing confidence and drive owes a good deal to young people. Its vast new dealing rooms are run by the young. People who made it not because of who they know or what school tie they wear, but on sheer merit. And that is the kind of society I want to see.
Capital was available, ideas were available, and there was a keenness to do things. And I think that probably the government felt that our merchant bankers and the City of London, which after all had put us on the map, there they were again, they were to go out and they were going to make us great again, if you like.
Money now became a commodity traded for itself. It was managed by young technicians in the dealing rooms. Economists who once thought they could control money became its servants. They were now employed in their hundreds by the banks to predict on television what might or might not happen as a result of the colossal flows of capital.
What do you see?
It is, of course, extremely uncertain, but my view is that...
But I guess there's still a lot more to come. We're currently saying people fear that there will be a rerun of what happened a fortnight ago.
I suspect it'll certainly not stop.
There is, however, a risk that interest rates will have to go higher.
It may even get worse.
When you see all the economists in the city on television giving their forecasts, they really see the economy as a complicated machine, something built by engineers. So you pull a lever here and you can see the effects working through and trace its effects through. Whereas in reality, the economy is far more complex. It's made up of human beings and it's really like a living organism. You prod it, sometimes it hops one way, sometimes it hops another. It's much more difficult than an engineering or a machine problem. It's a living organism that we're analysing.
When you get a loss of faith, say if bishops cease to believe in God, they're going for socialism or sodomy. But an economist who's agnostic about economics is unemployable, and therefore they said, we know if you do this and if you do that. And the economists will argue with each other, but none of them will ever question whether economics is as scientific as it claims.
Great Britain, the finest country in the world, right? And let us not forget who made it Great Britain this last 8 years.
When I go to the Western Summit in Venice on Monday, I will go with my head held high as leader of a strong country.
Somebody at the door. What? Listen.
There were people earning a lot of money without doing anything at all in this world of money. Then it suddenly came to a dramatic halt in the 80s. The reasons I can't give you, you'll need to talk to a qualified economist, and no doubt they'll have differing views on why it happened. But the system overnight became much more cutthroat. We had examples of firms right out of the blue calling fire drills, locking their employees out and throwing their belongings from the window to them and saying, sorry chaps, you're fired. That's how bad things became.
The bubble burst again. But that's what happens in history. You'll have these slumps and these booms, and you won't change it, because that's what capitalism is, really, isn't it?
I don't think we can change the world. It's not something we can do. Certainly we insolvency specialists can't. Our job is sweeping up or trying to prevent. Now, as far as I can see, the best way is to try and see whether we can do something about stopping people being greedy and stopping people being over-ambitious. And I don't think you ever will do that.
I mean, the economists seem to think that the whole of the problems can be solved by money, by the use of money rather than the creation of wealth. But they've never really got anywhere near it. So I would ask the question, whose money? What money? Where's it coming from?
10 years ago, Britain was a loser. Today, Britain is a winner.
Is the party over? Yes, Bunny, the party's over. The drink and the luck ran out.
Economics has really obscured the fundamental problems of the British economy by seeming to be able to get a particular solution by pulling a particular lever or pulling a set of levers. It's obscured the longer-term decline in our industries, the longer-term decline in the quality of our labour force, which politicians should really have been addressing 30 or 40 years ago, and which some of our European competitors, who've turned out far fewer economists in Britain, by the way, have succeeded in doing much better than we have in the UK.
For some economists who were involved in this story, there is a further question. Were their theories used to disguise political policies that would otherwise have been very difficult to implement in Britain?
The nightmare I sometimes have about this whole experience runs as follows. I was involved in making a number of proposals which were partly at least adopted by the government and put in play by the government. Now, my worry is as follows, that there may have been people making the actual policy decisions, or people behind them who never believed for a moment that this was the correct way to bring down inflation. They did, however, see that it would be a very, very good way to raise unemployment. And raising unemployment was an extremely desirable way of reducing the strength of the working classes, if you like. That what was engineered there, in Marxist terms, was a crisis of capitalism which recreated the reserve army of labour and has allowed the capitalists to make high profits ever since. Now, again, I don't say I believe that story, but when I really worry about all this, I worry whether, indeed, that was really what was going on.
What we now doubt, which we used to think, was that our models will enable us to look into the future and indeed to change the future to the benefit of mankind. The experience of recent years has been such that as soon as we develop a model that seems to be reasonably good at explaining the present, and there are few enough of those, God knows now, the future changes.
We live in an imperfect world, and if that's true, how are you ever going to make it a better world?
We can perhaps hope that we can prevent it becoming a worse world. I don't think that we can easily make it a better world.
Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Nobody knows but Jesus. Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Glory, hallelujah. Sometimes I'm up, sometimes I'm down. Oh, yes, Lord. Sometimes I'm almost to the ground. Oh, yes.